And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Tonight's weather showing a weak system moving in toward the southeast coast. Otherwise, weakening front, areas of snow over the interior. Next strong storm pulling northward here just east of the or west of the eastern Aleutians, bringing high wind warnings to the Fox Islands and Alaska Peninsula later tonight and tomorrow for winds gusting to 75 miles an hour. That will lift northward, hit Pribilof Islands with some very strong winds, also along the southwest coast, especially Nunivak Island. Increasing winds with snow mainly along the coastline here, and then that continues to drift northward thereafter into Wednesday, and that'll make for very windy conditions over the Bering Sea into the southwest coast, but not as windy, with areas of snow blowing snow from the Yukon Delta up to St. Lawrence Island, maybe getting into the Bering Strait. Pretty nice over the interior. This low down here brings a chance of snow into the western North Gulf Coast, but sunny for the southeast coast. Coastal water forecast. South coast of the Panhandle, southeast winds 15 knots for the day Tuesday. East winds 15 knots on the central coast, and north to northeast at 10 knots for the north coast. Lynn Canal, north winds 15 knots. Stevens Passage, north winds at 10 knots. Southeast at 10 for Clarence Strait. And then for the day on Wednesday, we've got east winds 10 to 15 knots for the south coast, central coast, east-southeast at 20, and then east and southeast winds at 15 knots for the north coast. Stevens Passage looking at north winds at 15 knots, Clarence Strait north at 10 knots, and Lynn Canal, north winds 20 knots with 4-foot seas. Prince William Sound, variable winds tomorrow at 10 knots. Otherwise, the North Gulf Coast, west-northwest winds 10 to 15 knots. Light variable winds for northern Cook Inlet, but small craft advisories for southern Cook Inlet for northeast winds at 25 knots. Those turn northerly at 25. Those 25-knot winds turn northerly for Kamishak Bay, and then southeast winds 20 knots for the Barren Islands. And for Cook Inlet, north winds 15 knots on Wednesday. Small craft advisories continue for southern Cook Inlet. North winds at 25 knots. Kamishak Bay, east winds 30 knots, 7-foot seas. East winds 25 with 7-foot seas for the Barren Islands. Western North Gulf Coast, east winds 25 knots. And east at 15 to 20 knots there toward Middleton Island. And Prince William Sound left them out. Light east winds at 10 knots with 2-foot seas. And for Kodiak Island, south to southwest winds 30 knots. On Tuesday, Bristol Bay, gale warnings, southeast winds 40 knots. Alaska Peninsula, southeast winds 45 knots. And then lighter winds out of the southwest on Wednesday here for the peninsula, southwest or south-southwest at 25 to 30 knots. Southeast winds 30 knots for Bristol Bay. Kodiak Island, east to southeast winds at just 20 knots. Eastern Aleutians tomorrow, storm warnings, south to southwest winds 45 to 50 knots, and southwest 40 to 45 knots for Adak and Atka. Western Aleutians, west-northwest winds at 30 knots. And for Wednesday, Western Aleutians, west-northwest winds 20 to 30 knots out that way, and Adak and Atka, west winds 30 knots. Eastern Aleutians, southwest winds 30 to 35 knots. And for the southwest coast, strongest winds here will be south of Nunivak Island tomorrow, up to 45 knots out of the southeast. Yukon Delta coast, brisk wind advisories for the southeast wind at 30 knots, east 30 knots for St. Lawrence Island, and about 25 knots from the east for Norton Sound. Gale warnings for St. Matthew Island, east winds at 35 knots, even stronger gales for the Pribilof, southeast 45 knots. And then for Wednesday, southwest 30 knots for the Pribilofs here. Gale warnings continue St. Matthew Island, southeast 35. And for the southwest coast here, southeast winds 30 to 40 knots. Southeast 30 for St. Lawrence Island, and east 30 for Norton Sound. Eastern Beaufort Sea coast tomorrow. East to northeast winds at about 10 knots. East winds 15 knots for the central coast, western Arctic coast, east winds at 20 knots. And the Chukchi Sea, east winds 25 knots. And for Wednesday, for the central and eastern Arctic coast, east winds at 15 knots. East winds 20 knots here for the western Arctic coast, and brisk wind advisories for the Chukchi Sea, where east winds are expected to be about 25 knots.